This is worksheet 21.1, and we're going to look at questions 8 through 10, which is asking us to focus on graph C. So here, in this previous section, we have graph C, and the first question that's being asked is, what happens to the equation when you plug in 20, 100, 1,000, or any really big number? So I'm going to go ahead and write down this equation, y equals 1/2 to the x. If I plug in a really big number, so for example 1,000, 1/2 to 1,000, this is 1 to 1,000, which is 1, over 2 to 1,000, which is some really big number. So if you have 1 over a really big number, you're getting a y value that's really close to 0. So y becomes very small. And you can also see that on the graph. As x is getting larger and larger and larger, our y value is getting really close to 0. If we plug in a really small negative number, so I'm going to plug it into the equation again, 1/2 to the negative, and then we'll just make that some really small negative number. This is actually telling us to do the reciprocal of this, and then make that a positive 200. 2 to the 200, that's some really big number, so we can say here that the y value becomes very large. And also graphically looking at this, if we have x values that are very negative on graph C, so as you go further and further left on the x-axis, this graph, the y value of the graph is getting larger and larger and larger. Question 10 is asking, does the graph have an x-intercept? How do you know? What do we call this? So as you look at this graph, as x gets really big, you can see that this graph is getting very close to 0, and as you plug in larger and larger values for x, we saw here that this number, this fraction, gets smaller and smaller and smaller, but it's never going to become negative. So what happens here is this graph never actually hits the x-axis. It's just going to get really close to it. It's never going to become negative. So what that's called is an asymptote. An asymptote is the line that the graph is getting very close to. So in this case, the x-axis is what we call the asymptote of the graph.